My name is Rogelio, and I work as a bus driver doing the last round of the night on a route that passes through sparsely populated areas. The job is generally quiet because at that time of night, hardly anyone gets on. The authorities insist on keeping the route active, even though I prefer driving at night because there's no traffic. Driving in the middle of nowhere at night has led me to witness strange things, but nothing has disturbed me as much as the people who walk along the edge of the road, far from any settlement. I saw the first person when I was just starting on this route. I was driving the assigned bus and saw a woman in a blue dress walking on the side of the road under the moonlight. We were in an isolated stretch, miles from anywhere, and I was the first vehicle she had seen since nightfall. She didn't even look up, just kept walking with a blank expression on her face. I honked the horn and she turned to look at me. I thought there must be some camp nearby, so I kept driving. I don't always see these people, but when they appear, it's as if they come out of nowhere. It seems like they're never there during the day. Once you know they're there, you start noticing them when you drive far from civilization, in complete darkness. Some drivers call them moon drifters, but I call them edge walkers because they're always on the edge of the road, walking aimlessly. They come in all shapes and sizes: men, women, tall, short, fat, thin, children, ordinary people. At first, I didn't pay them much attention beyond noticing them from time to time, in the brief moment they were visible as I passed by, not seeming to need my services or even noticing I was there. One night, a few months ago, I passed by what appeared to be an older woman. She was wearing a hospital gown and looked very ill. Her eyes were sunken, her hair white, and her skin extremely pale. She was smiling as if she were looking at a loved one. She was shuffling her feet along the edge of the road, and just by looking at her, I could imagine how tired she must have been. I wanted to keep driving because she scared me a lot, but she reminded me of my grandmother, so I stopped, grabbed the flashlight I always carry with me, and got off the bus. I could hear her footsteps before I saw her. I stood a few meters in front of her and saw her wrinkled feet in slippers, always dragging forward. There were still many miles to go before reaching the next town, and I knew she would never make it at that pace. I raised my flashlight and began to walk toward her. "Ma'am," I called out, hoping she would respond. I received no answer. But when the light finally reached her, I screamed when her figure appeared, not because she looked different, but because she seemed sicker up close and less alive. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you know there's nothing for miles? Do you want me to give you a ride?" She didn't say anything, just kept smiling and moving forward. My heart was pounding. I thought she was just very old and needed help. My feet were frozen in place as she got closer. When she was just a few meters away, her wrinkled hands began to stretch out toward me. Her fingers moved as if trying to reach my face. She opened her mouth but said nothing, just smiled. My legs buckled and I fell to the side. She crouched down to grab me with surprising speed. Before I knew it, her fingers were around my ankles, dragging me along the road. I desperately pulled back, but her strength was incredible. She looked at me with her sunken eyes and an open smile. I kicked as hard as I could, and to my horror, it was like kicking concrete. Thankfully, she let go, but her face showed no injury. I crawled toward the middle of the road, and she continued walking along the edge. Her hands fell to her sides, and her mouth closed into a tight smile, but her gaze remained fixed on mine as she walked out of the beam of my flashlight. I waited until the sound of her footsteps faded from my ears. After what seemed like many minutes of silence, I gathered the courage to get up and return to the bus. There was no trace of the woman, but when I sped up, it didn't take long to spot her again. Her eyes were still fixed on me. They probably had been the whole time, and the last thing I saw of her were her thin, smiling lips. According to other drivers, I am the first to try to interact with an edge walker, and if God is good, I will be the last. Since then, I have seen many more walking along the road in the darkness. Since that night, the walkers always look directly at me when I pass by, something they never used to do. But I will never stop again. Good evening, community. My name is Nicholas, and I want to share with you an experience that I have never been able to forget. It was the year 1995 when I started working as a driver for a bus line that ran various routes between cities. My first day on the job was a mix of nervousness and excitement. The buses were big and old, with that characteristic roar of the engine echoing on the cobblestone streets. From the very beginning, my coworkers, who were very superstitious, began telling me stories to scare me, especially about the route I took very early in the morning, from a small town to the capital of the other state. They told me about ghosts that appeared on the road and mysterious passengers who got on and disappeared without a trace. In those years, there were no highways like the ones we have now, just lonely and sometimes dangerous roads. One rainy morning, it was my turn to make the usual trip. It was one of those intense storms, with thunder and lightning. I set out with only a few passengers on board, barely a dozen people. Before leaving, I entrusted myself to God, a habit I had adopted from the first day, seeking a sort of protection on every trip. The route was familiar, and despite the rain, I felt confident. However, as we went on, the storm grew more intense, with the raindrops pounding against the windshield. Suddenly, when we reached a turnoff, something very strange happened. The darkness of the storm made it hard to see clearly, and suddenly we found ourselves on a cobblestone road I didn't recognize. At first, I thought I had made a wrong turn, but the road looked like nothing I had ever seen before on that route. My travel companion, visibly puzzled, asked me what was going on. The rain was so heavy that I had to stop the bus. When I looked at my watch to check the time, I realized it had stopped working, as had my companions. Trying to understand where we were, we decided that he would go out to investigate. The dense vegetation surrounded the stone path and brushed against the bus windows. I opened the door, and as the rain let up a bit, we both realized we were in an unknown place. My companion suggested we backtrack to try to return to the road, but the rain made the maneuver almost impossible. One of the passengers got up and asked if we had reached a certain point, but he soon realized that we were lost. His watch wasn't working either, and we were in a dilemma. With the rain easing up a bit more, I decided to slowly back up until we reached a crossroads of cobblestone paths. The tension on the bus was palpable. The few passengers who were awake watched anxiously as I tried to maneuver on the slippery terrain. The bus's lights barely penetrated the dense fog rising from the wet ground, creating an even more unsettling atmosphere. In the distance, through the mist, we saw a small wooden house. It seemed to be the only structure amid the vast vegetation. I decided to stop the bus and walk toward the house, accompanied by my companion. The passengers just watched us, some with pale faces of fear, and others murmuring among themselves. The ground was muddy, and I could feel the unusual chill of the season penetrating to my bones. When we reached the house, we saw an elderly man, smoking and fanning himself with a hat, dressed very strangely in coarse cloth garments. A man of a very unusual appearance. "Good evening," I said in a trembling voice. "Excuse me, do you know where the road is? We were doing fine, but we got lost." The man slowly looked up, and with a raspy and slow voice, he asked us where we came from. When I mentioned the name of the nearby town, his expression became even more intrigued. "Where is that?" he asked, as if he had never heard of the place. We looked at each other, bewildered. "We left that town not long ago," I explained, trying to stay calm. But he insisted there was no town nearby with that name, only other localities that were unfamiliar to us. The man looked at us with curiosity and a certain mistrust. "What kind of clothes are those you're wearing?" he asked, pointing to our bus company uniforms. I explained that we worked for a bus line, but he seemed not to understand. "What is that?" he asked with genuine confusion. I told him they were passenger buses, describing them as best I could, but he couldn't understand what we were talking about. We mentioned that our bus was stopped and that we wanted to get back to the road. The man responded that there were only paths and woods here, no roads. We thanked him for his time, although our doubts had only increased, and we returned to the bus. The rain had subsided a little more, which allowed us to turn around and retrace our steps with some difficulty. The journey back felt endless. I drove blindly, focused on following the same path we had come from, until I felt the steering wheel become steadier, a sign that we had returned to the road. There, a police officer stopped us when he saw the branches stuck to the bus, and I told him we had gotten lost. His look of surprise unsettled me. He told me it seemed like we had driven through the woods, and I mentioned the name of the place where we had been. "What place?" he asked. "There used to be a locality by that name up ahead, but that was a long time ago. No one lives there anymore." I returned to the bus and we continued on our way. It was as if I had gotten lost in time. To this day, I keep thinking about that strange event. I would like to know if anyone else has experienced something like this. Greetings to all. My name is Ruben. I come from a small town in Sonora, and for more than 20 years I've been a truck driver. Driving long distances has become my life, and I've traveled almost all the roads in Mexico. Throughout my career, I've faced all kinds of challenges: storms, poorly maintained roads, and on a few occasions, groups of thieves on deserted routes. However, nothing had prepared me for what I experienced 2 months ago on La Rumorosa Highway in Baja California. La Rumorosa is famous among truck drivers for its dangerous curves and the number of accidents that occur on its winding roads. It's a place where you must stay very focused while driving and give the highway the respect it deserves. The legends and stories of strange encounters are also common among those who, like me, have had to travel there at night. It was 2 in the morning when I found myself on the road, fighting off fatigue. I decided to stop at a small rest area to stretch my legs and have some coffee to stay awake and alert. The place was very lonely, and there was no noise except for the sound of some animals and my boots crunching on the gravel. After a few minutes, I got back into my truck and resumed my journey. The highway was completely deserted, and despite being used to driving in difficult conditions, the darkness made me feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I approached one of the most dangerous curves on La Rumorosa, my headlights illuminated something that sent a chill down my spine. A few meters ahead, near the edge of the road, there was a blurry figure. At first, I thought it was the reflection of a sign or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me due to fatigue. But as I got closer, the figure became clearer. It was a man, or at least that's what it seemed. He was dressed in dark clothing, and his posture was strange, almost unnatural. The silhouette was barely visible against the yellow line that separates the lanes, so I slowed down for fear of hitting him. The man raised his hand as if asking for help. Despite the fear I felt, something urged me to get closer. Maybe it was the human instinct to help someone who appears to need it, or perhaps a morbid curiosity to understand why someone would be out there in the middle of the night. I drove past him and turned my head to get a better look. That's when I saw him clearly. His gaze was empty, with his eye sockets completely dark. His pale face showed an open wound on his forehead, from which a light mist seemed to be emanating, disappearing into the air. Terror took over me and I stepped on the gas, getting away from that thing as quickly as possible. As I sped up, I couldn't stop glancing in the side mirror, hoping the figure would disappear. However, the farther I went, the more I felt like that man was getting closer. A little further on, I stopped to try to calm myself down. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking. I thought maybe I had imagined everything, that the fatigue had caused me to hallucinate such a horrible silhouette. I took a deep breath and forced myself to rationalize what I had seen. "It's just the fatigue," I repeated to myself. An illusion of my mind after so many hours behind the wheel. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw the same figure just a few meters from my truck. It was standing still, watching me with those empty eyes. My body tensed up completely and I felt a knot in my stomach. I started the truck again, desperate to leave that figure behind, until at some point, I lost sight of it. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I remembered the stories other truck drivers had told me about La Rumorosa, stories of a driver who had died in an accident years ago and whose spirit roams the highway, looking for help or company. Every mile I traveled, I felt as if the figure was following me. I constantly looked in the mirror, hoping not to see that figure again. Every shadow from the vegetation, every reflection on the road sent a shiver down my spine, thinking that man would be standing in front of me. Finally, I reached my destination, my heart still racing. I parked in the loading area and got out of the truck, trying to convince myself that everything had been a product of my imagination. But the feeling of having been watched, of being pursued, did not disappear. I decided to share my experience with some colleagues who confirmed what I had lived through. They had also seen the man on the road, in the same place, describing the same empty stare and the bleeding wound on his forehead. One never really knows what might be out on those lonely roads at night. Thank you for listening to my story. Good evening to all. My name is Eduardo. I used to work cleaning public transportation buses at night while studying during the day. There was a route that passed through a main highway leading to a rural area where buses could go at high speed. The drivers liked this route because it allowed them to leave the city, and the more experienced ones would often take it. But one tragic night, a car suddenly swerved in front of a bus, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. At the speed he was going, it was a miracle he managed to keep control of the vehicle. The driver was unharmed, but some passengers suffered severe injuries from being thrown from their seats. Unfortunately, a young pregnant woman who was standing at the back was thrown out and fell fatally. Despite the paramedics' efforts, neither she nor her baby survived. I was sent to the accident site to take the bus back to the garage. The driver had already left, and a police officer explained what had happened. I was driving alone, followed by my supervisor in another empty bus. The floor was covered in blood and cat litter. Once at the garage, I had to clean and disinfect the bus, a task that took me several hours. I finished around 1 in the morning, and when I returned, the director, the fleet manager, and my union representative were waiting for me. They explained that they wanted to keep the incident a secret, so I agreed without question. My last task was to park the bus in the repair area. Over the following weeks, everyone learned some details, but not that the victim was pregnant. The driver was so affected that he decided to retire. The bus was soon back in service. One night, I was at the fuel pumps when the fleet arrived. One of the last buses to arrive was covering the university route, the most complicated due to the drunk students returning from the bars. A rookie driver was handling it, and when I greeted him, I noticed he was very upset. He told me that at the last stop, after making sure everyone got off, he walked from the front to the back and didn't see anyone. However, 15 minutes later, while driving, he looked in the mirror and saw a girl standing at the back. He stopped the bus and turned around, but there was no one there. The driver was so disturbed that he asked me to check the bus again. It was empty, and I realized it was the same bus from the accident. Once it was fueled up and washed, I parked it on another route and went on with my duties. The following Friday, when I arrived, the veterans were talking with our supervisor about someone who had snuck into the garage. A driver claimed to have heard a child crying, but they couldn't find anyone. Over the next month, strange things kept happening. I heard a woman scream once. Others assumed it was just a troubled kid and turned up the music. The sightings of the sick child, as they called it, started to multiply. They were all driving the same bus. One driver asked to call a paramedic after seeing a pale woman with a child, though the police found no one on the route. But this made the connection to the accident clear, and the sightings became more frequent. This became such a distraction that drivers began refusing to drive the bus, claiming mechanical problems. Finally, it was taken out of rotation and put on hold. Summer came, and with the fleet update, all the buses were retired. However, the crying and sightings continued. We realized that the bus had been repainted and was still in use, but a week later, it was put in reserve and sold to the police as a detention bus. The following year, when I quit to continue my studies, a police officer came to refuel and just said, "I hate this damn bus. It gives me the creeps." I didn't ask why, and he didn't offer any more explanations. But that's okay.